Welcome to worship. This is parts of the worship service for Sunday, the 7th of November. If you'd like a copy of the complete order of service and haven't received one, please leave a message in Facebook or get in touch with me via email. Our call to worship. As we gather here in this place, there are no foreigners. All are welcome in God's house. Here, as we worship, there is only acceptance, for love is the language of faith. Here in our lives, there are no divisions, for God dwells in each of us. Let us worship in unity and love. Our opening hymn is "Let Us Build a House." If you don't have access to, well, if you're watching this, you do have access to the internet. So the YouTube link is in the order of service. You might like to pause here as you go through the rest of the service. We come to the Bible reading. Now, the Bible reading this week is the entire book of Ruth, which is not really that long. I know it might seem a lot when I say it's the entire book of Ruth, but really it's, let me find the right page. It's only 4 chapters long. It starts off by saying, "In the day the judges ruled." As I said, feel free to read the entire book of Ruth. It's not a long read. There's been a famine in the land of Israel. So Naomi and her husband Elimelech head off to Moab to where there's food. Their 2 sons marry 2 Moabite women. Then all 3 men die. So Naomi heads back to Israel, where there's now been a crop. And her 2 daughter-in-laws attempt to go with her. And she says to them, "No, don't. Why are you coming with me? It's not like I can have more sons for you to marry." And so one of them, Orpah, goes back to her people. But Ruth, the one the book is named after, says those words that many of you will know: "Where you go, I will go, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So they go back to Israel. And then we have these 2 women at the top one here in number 2, needing food. But there's a system at the time where you can glean from the edge of the fields anything that's left over after the harvesters have been through. And that's where Ruth meets Boaz. And he says, "Look after her, don't harass her." And Ruth goes home to Naomi and says, "I met Boaz." Naomi says, "That's great, he's part of the family." And then there's some cultural stuff happens and they end up getting married. And they have a son. And their son is in the line of David and therefore in the line of Jesus. This little square up the top here talks about how God's name is not mentioned very often, but we see the interplay of God's purpose and human decisions. We see tragedy, boldness and loyalty, and generosity in this interplay of God's purpose and human decisions. So I said, I encourage you to read the whole book. I'm just going to stop sharing that. Ruth. Ruth is a book of the Bible, and it's one of only 2 books named after women. The other one is Esther. Now, Ruth is also a person, an ordinary person, a foreigner and a widow. And this is a story about people, ordinary people. It's not a story about warriors or kings or priests. It's a story about people, about life and survival and birth and death and struggle and welcome and blessing. Like many people before and after, Naomi and Elimelech and their sons moved because of the famine. The same as the brothers of Joseph, who go looking for food in Egypt and find their younger brother. And it happens still today that people need to move for food. Naomi and Elimelech take their sons to search for food. The sons marry Moabite women, and all 3 men die. Now, this is a very perilous position for these women to be in. For at this time, a woman needed a man as protector and provider. Otherwise, she could be destitute and at risk. So Naomi makes a sensible decision to go back to Bethlehem now the famine is over. Surely someone in the family would look after her. And Ruth goes with her, even though Naomi points out that she's not likely to have another son for Ruth to marry. That refers to the system of a man marrying his dead brother's wife, so that she will have children to carry on the dead man's name and inherit his property. So what do we hear in this story? Well, we hear of the loyalty of a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. We read of unusual courtship practices, including Ruth asking Boaz to marry her. And it's also a story that moves from despair to hope, from death to life, from famine to abundance, from bitterness to joy, from barrenness to birth. It's a story about ordinary people, people like us, and how their story, how our story connects to the God story. You see, Ruth, this foreigner, this widow, is the great-grandmother of David. Yep, King David, an ancestor of Jesus. Now, for the people of Israel, being Jewish was important. There are parts of the Old Testament where they say, don't marry anyone who's outside of Israel. Yet here we have an outsider, a foreigner in the line of the great King David and the Messiah Jesus. So I thought, well, this gives us a few things to think about. One is, what is family? Is family about your bloodline, or about people who love us and are loyal to us? Who is family to you? It's also about how we live. The book of Judges, which is just before the book of Ruth, finishes with how the people did what they wanted. But what we see in the book of Ruth is people living in ways that allow others to live with dignity. Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth all act out of loyalty, love, and a deep sense of righteousness. And then we have these wonderful blessings. In the 4 chapters of this book, we read of people blessing each other. It would be a bit like us passing the peace. Such as when Boaz went to his field, he said to the harvest workers, "The Lord bless you." And they replied, "And may the Lord bless you." Now, it might be a little odd walking around the streets of Umina and Ettalong and Moiwoi saying, "The Lord bless you." But how might we bless others? We also see how God acts. We don't have God telling people to allow Ruth to be part of the community. There's no great miracles in this story. There's no walking on water. There's no burning bush. There's no manna or quail from heaven. Here we see God acting through circumstances and through the faithfulness of ordinary human beings. So what has all this got to do with us? The lives of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz are part of the story of God, and our lives are part of the ongoing story of God. Sometimes it can be difficult to see God in our lives, especially at times of grief and loss. I wonder how often we offer a blessing to people, even when we gather as a church. And as I said, you might not want to go down the main street of Yamina or Woy Woy or Ettalong saying, "The Lord bless you." But maybe when you meet up with church friends for coffee, or when you meet up at church, maybe you can offer that greeting of the blessing of God. One commentator wrote that there's an old adage that says, a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. Can you think of a time when a coincidence became a blessing? I'm not sure if I've told you this before, but when I was at university in my late teens, I was going to be a scientist or a science teacher. Then I changed to engineering, and there was this boy in my maths class. And he was also at the church I'd started going to. Now, each year my family was involved in running a canoe race down the Williams River from Dungog to Clarencetown. My dad was a big part of the organising committee. And the same year I changed to engineering, that same boy came to the race with some of his mates to help with communications. Because remember, this was before mobile phones. And this group of young men and boys, well, probably more young men, had two-way radios and all sorts of fancy radio gear. But it was like everywhere I went, here was this same person. And I remember asking one of the people at church, how would I know if he was the one? Saying he just kept being everywhere. Because God hadn't yelled at me or put our names in bright lights. Well, we've been married for 39 years, so maybe all those coincidences did have some of God's handiwork behind them. There's a word that keeps appearing in this story, a Hebrew word, hesed, which is goodness, kindness, faithfulness. And we see this in the book of Ruth, a tale about belonging, about blessing, about faithful love, hesed, God's faithfulness, shown in human beings. Can you see where your story connects with God's story? Not in moments of burning bushes or visions, but in those coincidences that turn out to be more than fleeting. Those things that turn out to be a blessing in your life and a blessing for the community. Where does your story connect with God's story? Can you see it? Where do you see God's faithfulness, God's covenant love lived out in the lives of everyday, ordinary human beings, just like you and me? You're invited to sing, "May the mind of Christ my Saviour." You can pause while you do that. And as you pray the prayer written in the order of service, and pray for those in our community who are in need of prayer and love. And our blessing. Go from here into this day and this week knowing that you are part of the story that God weaves in love for all of God's people. Take your place as one of God's beloved children. Make room for others, living a life of love and service in the family of God today and all days. And now may the Holy Trinity of love be upon you, the fire of the Spirit to ignite you, the love of God to encircle you, and the wisdom of Christ to enliven you, this day and forevermore. Amen.